The envelope fell onto the hospital bedside table with a dry sound that cut through the silence like a blade. My trembling fingers, marked by age spots and dialysis needles, hesitated before touching it. Michael remained there, standing, without looking directly at me, with that posture I knew so well, that of someone executing an unpleasant but necessary task. The metallic smell of the hospital mixed with his expensive cologne, creating a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to swallow all the oxygen in the room. "Sign this and disappear. You've lived long enough." The words left his mouth with the coldness of someone commenting on the weather. There was no anger, no hatred, just a cutting indifference that hurt more than any scream. My heart, already tired from 82 years of life, seemed to stop for an instant. There was my son-in-law, the man my daughter had chosen to share her life with, handing me my death sentence with the same naturalness with which one delivers a bill to be paid. Inside the envelope, as I discovered moments later, with hands that could barely hold the paper, was a medical treatment withdrawal document. Each line was a nail in my coffin, each clause a shovel of dirt over my existence. But what stabbed me most was the second part, the transfer of my few belongings, the small house where I raised Clara alone, and the land my late husband had left, directly to my daughter, knowing that, in practice, everything would fall into his hands. What Michael didn't know, while he watched me with those calculating eyes waiting for my signature, was that a small figure was hiding behind the hospital curtain. Laura, my 9-year-old granddaughter, held her diary against her chest, her eyes wide, like a child who had just witnessed something her young mind couldn't fully process yet, but her pure heart knew was deeply wrong. While the silence stretched between the three of us, me, Michael, and Laura's hidden presence, my mind flew back in time, like a wounded butterfly seeking refuge in the already withered flowers of its memories. It was 1963 when I buried my husband, John. Clara was only 8 years old, the same age Laura is today, and she cried, clinging to my black skirt while I tried to be strong for both of us. John had died young, victim of an accident at the factory where he worked as a welder. The smell of hot metal and oil always reminded me of him, as well as the affectionate way he called Clara, "little princess," every morning before leaving for work. We were left alone, two women against the world. I worked as a seamstress during the day and cleaned offices at night, while Clara studied. My hands, which today tremble holding this cursed paper, were then firm and skillful, dancing over fabrics and creating wedding dresses, baptism clothes, costumes for summer festivals. Each stitch was a prayer, each seam was an investment in my daughter's future. I remember the nights when Clara had a fever, and I stayed awake, placing wet cloths on her forehead, whispering lullabies that my own mother had taught me. When she grew up and wanted to study education, I sold my wedding ring and the gold watch John had given me on our first anniversary. Each sacrifice was worth it when I saw the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about her dreams of teaching children. Clara graduated and soon found work at a private school. It was there that she met Michael, an ambitious accountant who worked in administration. He was handsome, well-dressed, spoke politely, and seemed to have plans for the future. When Clara brought me to meet him, I forced a smile and said he seemed like a good young man. But there was something in his eyes that bothered me. A coldness disguised as politeness, a constant calculation behind every gentle gesture. During their courtship, Michael was attentive to me. He brought flowers, asked about my health, praised my cooking. But I noticed how his compliments sounded empty, as if they were memorized words for a theater play. Clara was too in love to notice, and I didn't have the heart to destroy her happiness by pointing out flaws that might just be the result of my distrust as an overprotective mother. They married in a simple ceremony. I sewed Clara's wedding dress myself, each pearl embroidered by hand, with the love of a mother who saw her only daughter becoming a woman. At the party, I danced with Michael and felt how impatient he was for the music to end. His fingers drummed discreetly on my back. His smile didn't reach his eyes. In the first years of marriage, visits became less frequent. There was always an excuse. Michael was tired from work. They had social commitments. They needed time to adjust as a couple. Clara would call me, but I could sense the pressure in her voice, as if each call was a concession extracted with great difficulty. Then Laura was born, and my world lit up again. When I held my granddaughter for the first time, I felt the same overwhelming love I had felt for Clara decades before. Laura had the curious eyes of the grandfather she never knew, and her mother's sweet smile. From a young age, she seemed to gravitate naturally toward me. While other children preferred electronic toys, Laura loved hearing my stories, helping water the garden plants, learning old recipes my grandmother had taught me. The weekends when Laura stayed with me were oases of joy. We made cakes together, she covered in flour from head to toe. I taught old songs, she showed me the music she learned at school. We walked hand in hand through the neighborhood, she telling about her little friends, me remembering what the street was like when Clara was small. At night, before sleeping, Laura would nestle beside me while I told invented stories about brave princesses and wise grandmothers. But Michael didn't like this closeness. I saw in his eyes the growing irritation whenever he came to pick up Laura and found her reluctant to leave. The indirect comments began that I spoiled the girl too much, that I was interfering with her education, that Clara needed to be more independent and not depend so much on mother's help. The visits became rarer. Clara began inventing elaborate excuses. Laura had many school activities, they were renovating the house, traffic was complicated to come to my neighborhood. I pretended to believe, but my heart broke a little more with each no, disguised as maybe next week. It was then that my health began to fail. First it was my legs, which swelled and hurt even after little effort. Then came the shortness of breath, which woke me at dawn, with the feeling that I was drowning in my own body. The tests revealed what I already suspected, deep in my heart. My kidneys were progressively failing. You need to start hemodialysis immediately, said Dr. Matthews, a gentle middle-aged man who reminded me a little of John. Without treatment, you have at most a few months. Clara cried when she learned of the diagnosis. She cried in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child, with sobs that came from deep in her soul. Michael, beside her, just nodded gravely and murmured something about doing what's necessary. But I knew that tone. It was the same one he used when talking about fixing an old appliance, resigned, calculating costs and benefits. Hospitalization was inevitable. My small apartment, which had always been my refuge, suddenly seemed like a prison for someone who needed constant medical care. Clara organized everything with the efficiency I had taught her, but I noticed how Michael supervised every decision, every expense, every medical procedure, like an accountant auditing the finances of a bankrupt company. And now, here I am, with this cursed envelope in my trembling hands, while the man my daughter chose to love offers me death, as if it were a favor. Michael looks at his wristwatch, impatient, as if my decision between living and dying were just another item on his tight schedule. Mrs. Candace, he says using that falsely respectful tone that always irritated me, you know that treatment is expensive. Clara is killing herself working to pay the medical bills. If you sign this, at least she'll have some financial security. It's the least you can do after everything she's done for you. His words are like poisoned knives, cutting from within. He's turning my love for Clara into a weapon against myself. He's making it seem like my survival is an act of selfishness, that my death would be a generous gift to my own daughter. But it's at this moment that the curtain moves slightly, and I see a little piece of Laura's pink dress. My granddaughter is there, witnessing everything, and suddenly I'm no longer just an old and sick woman facing a predator. I'm Laura's grandmother, Clara's mother, John's widow, my parents' daughter, my grandmother's granddaughter. I'm a chain of love that extends through generations, and I cannot allow this chain to be broken by the greed of a cold man. That night, after Michael left muttering threats disguised as concern, something extraordinary happened. Laura, who should have been home sleeping, appeared at the hospital, accompanied by Nurse Sandra, a young woman with curly hair, who always treated patients with genuine affection. "Grandma," whispered Laura, approaching my bed with eyes shining with determination, "I brought something important." In her small hands was the old wooden box I kept in my bedroom closet. How had she managed to get to my house and return with Sandra? How had a 9-year-old organized this small rescue mission? These questions dissolved when I saw what Laura took from the box, my John's war diary. I had forgotten it was there, half hidden among yellowed photographs and handwritten love letters. John had always been shy about talking about the war, but he wrote about his experiences with brutal honesty. And there, in an entry dated March 1944, was the story I never knew he had recorded. Today, I met an angel. Laura read with her child's voice, but pronouncing each word with reverent care. When the bombs fell on the field hospital, everyone ran for cover. Everyone except a young nurse with black hair and determined eyes. She went back 3 times into the burning building to carry wounded soldiers who couldn't walk. She saved my life and that of 2 other comrades. Her name is Candace, and I'm going to marry her as soon as this war is over. The silence that followed Laura's reading was different from the heavy silence Michael had brought. It was a silence of reverence, of discovery, of love rediscovering its own roots. Sandra wiped her eyes discreetly. Other patients in the room had stopped their conversations to listen, and I felt as if I were seeing my own life through a new prism. Grandma was a war hero, declared Laura with the absolute certainty that only children possess, and heroes don't give up. It was Sandra who took the diary to Dr. Matthews. It was Dr. Matthews who showed it to the hospital director, and it was the director, Dr. Beatrice, an elegant 60-year-old woman, who came personally to my room the next day. Mrs. Candace, she said, sitting in the chair beside my bed, with the same delicacy used to converse with royalty. I didn't know we had a war veteran among our patients, a veteran who saved lives when she was barely 20 years old. The story spread through the hospital like wildfire. The nurses began greeting me in the corridors with new respect. Other patients came to talk to me, wanting to hear war stories I didn't even know were so important. A local journalist appeared to do a story about the woman who lived long and saved many. But it was when Clara appeared at the hospital, dragging Michael behind with an expression I had never seen on my daughter's face, that I knew something fundamental had changed. Clara held a copy of the local newspaper with my photo on the front page, and her eyes shone with a mixture of pride and fury that reminded me of the determined girl she had been in childhood. "Mom," she said, completely ignoring Michael, who cowered behind her like a shameless dog, "I didn't know. I never knew you had been a nurse in the war. Why didn't you ever tell me?" It was a fair question. During all these years, I had kept those memories as if they were secrets too dangerous to be shared. Maybe because the war seemed like a distant nightmare, not worth resurrecting. Maybe because I didn't consider myself a hero, just a young woman doing what needed to be done. Or maybe because after a lifetime of being just mother and grandmother, I had forgotten that I was once also Candace, the woman who ran toward danger when everyone else ran in the opposite direction. I didn't think it was important. I lied, because the truth was that I had forgotten myself over the years of caring for others. Clara turned to Michael with a controlled fury that filled me with pride and apprehension at the same time. In that moment, I saw that she was no longer the submissive wife who accepted her husband's decisions without question. She was my daughter, the brave girl I had raised rediscovering her own strength. "Explain to me," she said, with a low and dangerous voice, "how you had the audacity to ask my mother to give up treatment. Explain how you thought you had the right to enter this room and humiliate a woman who saved lives when you weren't even born." Michael tried to argue, brought numbers, talked about costs and financial reality, but his words sounded hollow before the new Clara that had emerged, like a butterfly coming out of a cocoon that had long kept her prisoner. She interrupted him with a gesture that admitted no contestation. "Get out of my way," she said. "I'm going to take care of my mother, with or without you. And if you can't accept that, then you can manage on your own." At that moment, I knew I had raised my daughter right. All the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights, all the dresses sewn by candlelight, had been worth it to produce this strong woman who stood before me, finally free from the bonds of a marriage that diminished her. Michael tried a few more arguments, appealed to reason, talked about mature decisions, but each word only dug his own grave deeper. Nurse Sandra, who had become our silent ally, appeared with the discharge paperwork and a smile that didn't disguise her satisfaction at seeing that small man being put in his proper place. Laura, during all this tense exchange between the adults, remained by my side holding my hand with the surprising strength of her small hands. She had been the catalyst for all this transformation, the wise child who could see through adult lies and find the truth buried in a dusty box. "Grandma," she whispered in my ear while Clara organized my discharge from the hospital, "I'm going to write a book about you. It will be called The Woman Who Lived Long, and everyone will know you're a hero." This childish promise touched me more deeply than all the hospital honors. It was as if Laura were giving me back my own story, reminding me that I was more than just a sick grandmother waiting to die. Stories like this of ordinary women who discover extraordinary strength in the most difficult moments deserve to be told and retold. If you believe that every life has value and that true love always wins, subscribe to the channel to follow more accounts that celebrate the silent courage of women who change the world around them, one brave attitude at a time. Adapting to the new life wasn't easy. Clara decided to separate from Michael definitively, a painful but necessary process like surgery that removes a tumor. He tried to fight for shared custody of Laura, but his own greed betrayed him when the lawyers discovered his attempt to force me to give up medical treatment. The judge had no difficulty deciding what kind of father Michael really was. I went back to living with Clara and Laura in a rented house smaller than the previous ones, but infinitely fuller of love. My mornings now began with the sound of Laura getting ready for school, her giggles while Clara tried to comb her rebellious curls. I helped with what I could, folding clothes, preparing lunch, telling stories when Laura had nightmares. Medical treatment continued, subsidized partially by the hospital and partially by a fundraising campaign that the local community organized after the newspaper story. I discovered that our city had many more generous people than I imagined. Neighbors who barely knew me appeared with donations, groceries offered discounts, the pharmacy got special prices for my medications, but the greatest transformation didn't happen in my body, it happened in my soul. For decades, I had defined myself only through my relationships, John's wife, Clara's mother, Laura's grandmother. Now slowly, I was rediscovering Candace, the woman who existed independently of any role she played for other people. I began writing my own memoirs, encouraged by Laura, who insisted I should record my stories before they escape from your head, Grandma. The memories came back gradually, like photographs slowly developing in a dark room. The war nursing, the soldiers I saved, the constant fear masked by the need to act, young love for John growing amid chaos. Laura, faithful to her promise, really began writing her book about me. Of course, at 9 years old, her version was more fantasy than biography. I appeared flying over battlefields and healing soldiers with magic potions, but the love behind each invented word was absolutely real, and I kept each scribbled page as if it were a treasure. Clara flourished without the bonds of the oppressive marriage. She got a better job at a private school, where her experience and new confidence impressed the principal so much that she was promoted to pedagogical coordinator in just 6 months. At night, she studied for a master's degree in education, determined to build a solid career that would guarantee our financial security. "Mom," she said to me on one of those study nights, taking off her glasses and looking at me with affectionate seriousness, "I apologize for taking so long to see who you really are. For letting Michael make me forget that you're not just my mother, you're a complete person with your own incredible story." This conversation happened 6 months after my hospital discharge, on a rainy afternoon when Laura had fallen asleep on the sofa while I read to her. Clara sat beside me, and for the first time in years, we talked like two adult women, not just as mother and daughter. I spoke about my fears during the war, about how I met John, about the difficulties of raising her alone, about the prejudices I faced as a young widow in the 60s. Clara shared her own struggles, the pressure to be the perfect wife, the fear of disappointing expectations, the loneliness of a marriage without true love. "I think I learned from you," she said, "that it's better to be alone and true to yourself than to be accompanied and live a lie." These words filled me with a different pride than what I felt when she was small and got good grades at school. It was the pride of seeing that my daughter had become a wise woman, capable of making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. A year after my hospitalization, we received an unexpected letter. It was from one of the soldiers I had saved during the war, a man named Albert, who had spent decades looking for me through veteran organizations. He had read the story about me in the local newspaper, which ended up being republished in several other places, and finally got my address. "Dear Candace," the letter said, "during all these years I was never able to thank you for risking your life to save mine. You carried me on your back for almost a kilometer to the nearest medical post while bombs were still falling around us. Thanks to you, I was able to return home. marry, have children, live a full life. My grandchildren have a great-grandmother they adore, and all of this exists because a brave young nurse didn't let me die in a bombed hospital. The letter continued for 3 pages, telling about the life Albert had built, the children he had, the grandchildren he had met. At the end, he attached photographs of his entire family holding a sign that said, "Thank you, Candace." There was also an invitation to visit them, with all expenses paid, for a war veterans reunion that would take place in his city. Laura was ecstatic about the letter. For her, it was definitive proof that her grandmother was indeed a real hero, not just from the stories she invented. Clara cried reading the thanks, realizing that her mother had literally saved future generations of an entire family. We decided to accept the invitation. It was my first airplane trip, at 83 years old, a frightening and wonderful experience at the same time. Laura held my hand during the entire flight, pointing at the clouds through the window and inventing stories about people who lived in the sky. The veterans' reunion was a surreal experience. I was one of the few women present, and certainly the only civilian nurse who had served in field hospitals. Albert was now a man with white hair and deep wrinkles, but his eyes shone with tears when he saw me. "You saved my life," he repeated several times, holding my hands as if I were a miracle materialized before him. "You saved my life, and I was never able to forget you." During the event, other veterans approached to hear my story. I discovered that many of them remembered brave nurses who had helped them, but few knew the names of these women. It was as if we were anonymous angels, appearing in the most desperate moments and disappearing into the nebulous memory of trauma and gratitude. A military historian, who was documenting the event, asked me to record a testimony about my experience as a civilian nurse. This recording ended up being used in a documentary about women in World War II, and suddenly I found myself being interviewed by journalists and students interested in oral history. "How did you find the courage to return to the bombed hospital?" asked a young journalism student, her eyes shining with the thirst for knowledge that reminded me of Clara at the same age. "I didn't think about courage," I replied honestly. "I just thought there were people who needed help, and I could help." When you see someone suffering, you don't stop to calculate the risks, you simply do what needs to be done. This simple answer seemed to fascinate people. As if it were impossible to believe that heroic acts could arise from motivations as basic as compassion and sense of duty. But the truth is that most heroes are ordinary people who, when they reach their limit, choose to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. When we returned from the trip, our life had changed again. Invitations for lectures began to arrive, television programs wanted to interview me, schools asked for me to tell my story to students. Laura was radiant whenever she saw me on television, recording everything to show her school friends. But the most important thing was that our small family had found a new and healthy balance. Clara was thriving professionally, Laura was growing surrounded by stories of courage and love, and I had discovered that I still had much to offer the world. One afternoon, while helping Laura with her history homework about World War II, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Grandma, are you afraid to die?" The question came from a 10-year-old child, but carried the weight of an adult philosopher. I looked into her serious eyes, so similar to John's, and thought carefully before answering. "I was afraid," I admitted. "Especially when Michael brought me that paper in the hospital. At that moment, I felt as if my life had no value to anyone. But now I understand that dying isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person. The worst is living without knowing who you really are, or dying without having loved and been truly loved." Laura processed this answer for a few minutes, absent-mindedly scribbling in the margin of her notebook. "So you're not afraid anymore?" "Not exactly," I replied. "I still prefer to live, of course. I want to see you grow up. I want to see your mother happy. I want to finish writing my memoirs. But if my time comes, I'll leave knowing I lived a life full of love, and that I leave behind people who are better for having known me. That's not a small thing." 2 years have passed since that conversation. My treatment continues, my health has stabilized, and our life has found a quiet but full rhythm. Clara remarried, this time to Paul, a gentle and generous literature teacher who treats Laura like a daughter and treats me like the respected matriarch I deserve to be. It's not the burning love she had in youth, but it's the mature and companionate love that sustains a lifetime. Laura, now 12 years old, is really writing a book about me. No longer the childish fantasy full of magical powers, but a serious biography based on interviews she conducts with me every week, recording everything on a cell phone she got for her birthday. She asks me questions that surprise me with their depth, forces me to remember details I thought were lost forever. A few weeks ago, we received unexpected news. Michael had tried to contest the divorce, claiming that Clara had abandoned him unjustly. He wanted alimony and part of the assets we acquired after the separation. His audacity still surprises me, even after so much time. But this time, we were prepared. Clara had kept all the documents related to his attempt to force me to give up medical treatment. Michael's lawyer tried to argue that he was just concerned about the family's medical costs, but the judge wasn't impressed. "You asked an 82-year-old woman to sign a medical treatment withdrawal document so you could inherit her belongings," said the judge, with a coldness that reminded me of my own words to Michael that day in the hospital. "That's not family concern. That's attempted homicide by abandonment. You should be grateful you're not facing criminal charges." Clara left the courthouse holding hands with me and Laura, 3 generations of women from our family united against any attempt to divide or diminish us. At that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that all the pain I had gone through had been worth it to reach that point. Today, as I write these last lines of my memoirs, I can hear Laura and Clara talking in the kitchen about weekend plans. Paul is helping Laura with a science project about medicinal plants, using the herbs I grow in the small garden we made in the backyard. Life continues, simple and precious, full of the small moments that form a complete existence. My body is still fragile, my kidneys still need constant care, my legs still hurt when the weather is going to change. But my soul is stronger than it has ever been. I discovered that true strength doesn't come from never falling, but from always getting up. It doesn't come from never being afraid, but from acting despite fear. It doesn't come from never needing help, but from knowing how to accept love when it's offered with sincerity. Michael's attempt to silence me forever ended up having the opposite effect. It made me discover my own voice, made me remember who I had always been beneath all the roles I played for other people. I am Candace, the woman who saved lives during the war. I am Candace, the widow who raised a daughter alone. I am Candace, the grandmother who loves unconditionally. I am Candace, the woman who refused to die when they told her she had lived enough. This is my story, the story of an ordinary woman who discovered that her life was extraordinary not for great heroic gestures, but for the silent persistence of love. A woman who was almost silenced, but who found her voice precisely when she needed it most. And if someone somewhere is reading these words and feeling invisible, forgotten, worthless, I want you to know, you have an important story to tell. You have love to give and strength to discover. You have the right to occupy space in this world, to breathe this air, to live this life fully. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't sign the paper that determines your silence. Don't believe when they tell you that you've lived enough. Because the truth is that while there's love in your heart and stories in your memory, you haven't lived enough yet. You still have much to live, much to love, much to teach the generations that will come after you. This is the lesson I learned at 84 years of age, when it was almost too late. We are not just the daughters, wives, mothers, and grandmothers we were for other people. We are complete women, with our own stories of courage, our own silent victories, our own infinite capacity to transform the world around us through love. And that by itself is reason enough to continue living, to continue fighting, to continue loving, to continue being who we really are, until the last day of our extraordinarily ordinary and incredibly precious lives.